What if the most shocking thing Meghan Markle ever said wasn't caught on camera, wasn't printed in a headline, and wasn't meant for the world to hear at all? What if it was whispered quietly, years ago, to the one person who knew her before the crown, before the cameras, before Prince Harry? And what if that sentence was this: "I won't stay forever"? Sit with that for a moment. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because if that claim is true, if Thomas Markle is telling the truth, then the entire story we've been sold begins to wobble. The fairy tale, the love story, the great escape from the palace, all of it. This isn't just celebrity gossip. This isn't another recycled headline about royal drama. This is about motive, about intention, about whether one of the most talked about marriages in modern history was built on love or something far more calculated. And here's the unsettling part. Thomas Markle says he heard it coming, long before the wedding, long before the Oprah interview, long before the world split into sides. He says the warning was there from the beginning. So why are we only hearing this now? And why does it matter more than ever? Let's start with what everyone thinks they already know. Most people believe this story is simple. A prince meets an American actress. They fall in love. The palace proves unbearable. Racism, pressure, tradition, and cruelty push them out. Meghan and Harry flee to protect their peace. That's the version you've heard 1,000 times. But what if that story skips a crucial chapter? What if the ending was always part of the plan? Thomas Markle has been dismissed for years, painted as bitter, unreliable, embarrassing, the father who talked too much, the man who couldn't stay out of the spotlight. But here's a question worth asking, honestly. Why would a father willingly become one of the most hated men in a global media storm? Unless he felt there was something the world needed to hear. Think about it. He didn't gain admiration. He didn't gain access. He didn't gain reconciliation. What he gained was isolation, public mockery, estrangement from his daughter, a permanent label as the problem. And yet, he keeps talking. That alone should make you pause. Because people who are lying usually change their stories. People who are bitter usually lash out wildly. But Thomas Markle keeps returning to the same theme, the same discomfort, the same memory, a private conversation, a sentence that never sat right with him. Now, before anyone rushes to judgment, let's be clear about something. This is not a verdict. This is not a declaration of guilt or innocence. This is an exploration of claims, context, and contradictions. Because stories like this are rarely black and white. They live in the gray. And the gray is where the truth often hides. So why does this story matter now? Because the timing has changed everything. Public opinion has shifted. The constant media protection has thinned. Harry and Meghan's projects no longer land the way they once did. The cultural moment that once amplified every grievance has cooled. And suddenly, voices that were once ignored are being re-examined, including Thomas Markle's. He's older now. His health has declined. And by his own admission, he doesn't have the luxury of waiting anymore. When someone reaches that point in life, they stop speaking for attention. They start speaking for the record. Thomas isn't trying to rewrite history. He's trying to preserve his version of it before it's gone. And that's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because Thomas Markle doesn't frame his daughter as a villain. He frames her as someone who always knew how to leave. From a very young age, Meghan understood reinvention. New schools, new circles, new identities. She learned how to adapt, how to present, how to survive in rooms where she didn't quite belong. That's not a flaw. In many ways, it's a strength. But there's a difference between adaptability and impermanence. Thomas says he saw both. He says Meghan never clung to chapters once they stopped serving her growth. Careers changed. Relationships ended. Values shifted. And each time, she moved forward without looking back. Again, not evil, not cruel, but revealing. So when she entered the most rigid institution on earth, the British monarchy, Thomas claims he felt a familiar tension. A woman built for movement, stepping into a world designed for stillness. Ask yourself this: how long could that ever last? And here's where the story sharpens. According to Thomas, there were conversations before the wedding that didn't sound like a woman swept away by destiny. They sounded like a woman assessing risk, calculating endurance, discussing exits, not divorce plans, not dates, but the idea that leaving was possible, that staying wasn't guaranteed, that permanence was conditional. If you're in love, deeply, wildly in love, Do you talk like that? Or do you talk like someone who knows how to land on their feet no matter how the story ends? Thomas says the sentence wasn't cruel. It wasn't angry. It was calm, matter of fact, as if she were stating something obvious. And that's what disturbed him. Because when someone tells you they might leave someday, they're not confessing doubt. They're preparing you. The public never saw this version of Meghan. They saw confidence, advocacy, strength, vulnerability carefully framed for cameras. But fathers see what the world doesn't. They hear the pauses between words. They notice what's not being said. And Thomas says what he heard didn't sound like someone betting everything on forever. Now, you might be thinking, so what? People say things. Feelings change. Life evolves. That's true. But here's the contradiction that makes this impossible to ignore. If Meghan knew leaving was an option from the beginning, why was the narrative later framed as escape rather than choice? Why was departure described as survival rather than strategy? Why was the world told there was no way out if, privately, the possibility had already been discussed? These are not accusations. They are questions. And questions are dangerous when they don't have clean answers, especially when billions of dollars, global influence, and historical institutions are involved. Thomas says he tried to warn people. Not the media, not the public. He tried to warn himself. Because once he heard that sentence, he says he felt it in his gut. That cold parental intuition that whispers, something here won't end the way it begins. And when the royal exit finally happened, he wasn't shocked. He was resigned. He says it felt less like a tragedy and more like confirmation. But if that's true, then another question follows, and it's even more uncomfortable. Did Harry know? Was he aware that this was never guaranteed? Or did he believe the fairy tale while someone else quietly held the contingency plan? Thomas doesn't answer that directly. He doesn't need to, because the implications speak for themselves. This isn't about blaming Meghan, and it's not about protecting Harry. It's about understanding power dynamics in modern relationships, how narrative control shapes perception, how public sympathy can be engineered long before the public realizes they're part of the story. And it's about a father who believes his daughter's greatest strength, her ability to walk away, may also be the one thing that was never honestly acknowledged. The media told us this was a story about love versus tradition. Thomas suggests it may have been about something else entirely. Freedom versus obligation. Control versus surrender. Choice versus permanence. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. If Thomas Markle is lying, then he has sacrificed his reputation for nothing. But if he's telling the truth, then the most important sentence in this entire saga was spoken long before any vows were exchanged. So before we can judge what happened between Meghan, Harry, and the monarchy, before we decide who was right, who was wrong, and who was mistreated, we have to go back. Back before the palace gates. Back before the headlines. Back to the girl who learned, early on, that life rewards those who know when to stay and when to leave. Because what came next didn't start with a prince. It started with ambition. And that changes everything. What do you see when you think of Meghan Markle today? A princess? A global celebrity? A humanitarian? Someone in the crosshairs of endless media scrutiny? Those images are familiar, comfortable even. But long before the royal title, before the cameras, before the headlines and the Oprah interview, there was a little girl in Los Angeles, trying to find her place in a world that didn't quite know what to do with her. Thomas Markle remembers her vividly. He remembers a child who was clever, observant, and fiercely independent. Not just bright, not just charismatic, but determined in ways that could intimidate a parent. He remembers watching her sketching in notebooks, improvising scenes, performing for no audience, rehearsing dialogues in her bedroom, as if the world depended on her performance. It was as if she understood, even at 8 or 9 years old, that life rewarded those who could project exactly what the world wanted to see and hide what it didn't. From a young age, Thomas noticed something else. Meghan was a quick study in adaptability. Friendships came and went, schools changed, and she pivoted gracefully each time. But adaptability was more than just a social skill. It was survival. Her mother had moved in and out of her life. Blended family dynamics were complex, and in every change, Meghan learned to assess, to measure, to negotiate. That quiet, relentless calculation is what Thomas believes set the stage for everything that came later. But it wasn't all ambition and calculation. there were flashes of vulnerability, a longing to be understood, a need for connection. She wanted love like any child does, but she also wanted to control how it arrived, when it arrived, and from whom. These dualities, Thomas says, were what made her remarkable and what made her difficult to read. By the time she was a teenager, Meghan was already aware of the world beyond her Los Angeles neighborhood. She watched actors, activists, and public figures navigate scrutiny, fame, and the machinery of Hollywood. She studied the way they carried themselves, the decisions they made, and the personas they presented. And she began building her own version of herself, a version that could withstand scrutiny, disappointment, and the inevitable betrayals of ambition. This is where the first critical pattern emerges. Thomas recalls countless conversations in which Meghan spoke about the future, not as a dreamer, but as a planner. She didn't merely fantasize about success, she outlined paths to it. She considered obstacles, calculated timing, and prepared alternatives. Every goal had a contingency plan, and every friendship, every romantic encounter, was seen through the lens of potential impact. Some parents might dismiss this as precociousness. Others might see it as a warning. Thomas felt a mix of pride and unease. He marveled at her drive, but worried about the emotional cost. She was ambitious, yes, but she also seemed determined never to be dependent, never to be trapped. Even at 16, he sensed an internal compass that guided her toward autonomy, not attachment. Hollywood became her proving ground. Her early roles weren't glamorous, they were testing grounds. Small parts on television, commercials, and independent films. Each performance polished her skills and increased her visibility. She learned how to command a room, how to deliver lines with conviction, and how to pivot under pressure. Yet behind the scenes, Thomas noticed something subtler. A readiness to step away from opportunities if they didn't align with her vision. She would walk from projects, auditions, or even friendships if she sensed they were misaligned with her larger plan. This pattern of engagement and strategic withdrawal would later define her relationships in ways that shocked the public. But even then, it was evident. Thomas says he saw the signs long before anyone else did. She wasn't capricious. She was calculating. Not cruel, just pragmatic. And that pragmatism, he feared, would one day collide with the fairy tale world she was about to enter. By the time Meghan approached adulthood, she had already experienced several reinventions. Each move, each transition, was carefully executed. New schools, new social circles, new opportunities. And through it all, Thomas observed a remarkable consistency. Meghan always landed on her feet, always maintained control over her narrative, and always kept a version of herself reserved, hidden from those who might try to claim her. Yet, Thomas recalls, it wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding power. Even as a teenager, Meghan was conscious of dynamics, who had influence, who could help her advance, and how public perception could be manipulated. She read the room, read the people, and made decisions with remarkable clarity. In hindsight, Thomas says, these were the traits that allowed her to navigate Hollywood, media scrutiny, and eventually, the monarchy. But ambition alone doesn't explain everything. There were moments of tenderness, moments of uncertainty, moments where she sought approval from her father or validation from peers. These glimpses into her inner life were rare, fleeting, and often overshadowed by her drive. Thomas remembers them because they were ephemeral. Small cracks in the carefully constructed facade she was already developing. And yet, those moments mattered. They revealed that beneath the confidence and strategic thinking, Meghan was still human. She still desired connection, affirmation, and, crucially, understanding from her father. Thomas says that it was this combination, relentless drive and occasional vulnerability, that made her both compelling and inscrutable. He understood her ambition. He admired it. But he also sensed that one day, it might create distance, even within their own family. By the time she left for college and began her professional acting career, the patterns were unmistakable. She pursued opportunities that aligned with her personal brand. She cultivated relationships that would support her ascent. She avoided entanglements that might compromise her autonomy. And she honed a skill that would later astonish the world. The ability to present a persona that was public-facing and meticulously curated, while privately retaining full control over her choices and directions. Thomas remembers sitting quietly, observing, reflecting. He was proud of her resilience. He worried about her emotional armor. He marveled at her clarity. And he began to notice something that would resonate years later, once the world knew her as a duchess. Meghan Markle had never been content with permanence for its own sake. She understood impermanence. She anticipated exits. She prepared for them. And that's why, according to Thomas, the sentence she would one day utter to him, years later, wasn't out of character. It wasn't shocking in its content. It was shocking in its timing, because it confirmed something he had suspected all along. That beneath the glamour, beneath the charm, beneath the fairy tale aspirations, Meghan always had a contingency plan. So as we step forward into the chapters that follow, into the Hollywood years, the meeting with Prince Harry, the whirlwind wedding, and the royal exit, keep this image in mind. A girl who learned early that life rewards those who know when to stay, when to pivot, and when to walk away. A daughter whose ambition, foresight, and inner compass would later collide with the most scrutinized institution on the planet. And that question, whether Thomas Markle could ever truly comprehend the trajectory of Meghan's life, would become central to everything that followed.